A suicide bomber has killed at least 100 in a Shia mosque in Afghanistan. The ISIS has claimed the dastardly attack. And this has opened a window into what can be expected in Afghanistan now, a play out of all kinds of forces for whom this is now free territory to work out from. The Taliban is seen as a bedfellow by many of the radical groups operating in the region. It is in recognition of this that China, Russia, Iran, and other countries have been trying to pressure them into providing a stable and more democratic government than their past. However, with the mosque attack, Iran at least will find itself under pressure on this front. The world is still engaging with the Taliban, and in a first, US officials will be meeting with senior Taliban representatives in Doha shortly. There is far more to geopolitics than meets the eye, and Afghanistan under the Taliban is still the fulcrum for emerging new alliances in the region and across the world. All players except India are engaging with the Taliban, but even so, all balls are up in the air, making prediction impossible.
Hello. Our guest today is Ambassador Gautam Mukhodhyay. He's represented India and been our envoy in many countries of concern, Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar. So we're really happy to have you here to talk with us on all these issues. But I'm going to start, of course, with Afghanistan because that's always been in the news. The Taliban has taken over, the Taliban is talking to everyone, the world is sort of playing footsie with the Taliban. Some have become more excited that it's in power. How do you see it proceeding? Do you think they'll be able to give a stable government that the world will be able to recognize?
Thank you, Seema. It's really very nice to be in your show, in The Citizen, a periodical that I really always enjoyed, at least what I read of it. Let me just go back with a little perspective. I happened to reopen the Embassy of India in 2001 after the ouster of the Taliban from Kabul. That transition was very different from this one. The Taliban were ousted. This was the Ramzan. The atmosphere was subdued. Celebrations only began after Eid or with Eid when celebrating gunfire was shot. But there was no fear. The atmosphere was subdued but peaceful. The inauguration of Taliban, people call it 2.0, but I actually call it 3.0. I'll go into the reasons for that later. Is entirely different. In many ways, it was a 20-year hybrid war that Pakistan executed in Afghanistan, and its arrival was really marked by horrible episodes of violence and also various forms of repression, as well as reaction and rebellion. And of course, the classic case of that was the August 27 attack at the airport, which killed close to 200 Afghans, as well as some 30 US soldiers. So I just want to reflect a little on that. Either the Haqqani network, which was in charge of security of Kabul and Kabul airport, didn't know that this, couldn't control the ISK, which is blamed for this particular attack. Or the only alternative could be that it was in the know, but wanted to convey a message to all those people who were trying to leave Afghanistan. So seeing this, I think there are two aspects. One is clearly, the Taliban have taken over by military force through deception over 20 years of a very complex kind of preparations. And now they are in power in an atmosphere of sort of multiple levels of friction and violence. There is, of course, the Taliban and what I would call is the large majority of the Afghan people who are not in a state of shock right now, but who are fundamentally ill-disposed to a regime that they do not regard as organic or local or indigenous, that has been in fact inflicted and imposed from Pakistan. And this takes manifestation in many forms. You see the flag protests, you see the color protests, you see the women's protests, you see the armed resistance in various places, and other forms of resistance that are only likely to grow right now. But there are frictions within the Taliban. We have the intra-Mujahideen fighting of the 1992-96 period. That could happen. There are frictions between elements and factions of the Taliban and the ISI that could also surface at any given point of time. There is the big real issue of the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda and the ISK, who are, sort of, at cross purposes and against each other. Though at some levels there are various agencies, again, possibly run by Pakistan, like there are network connections between the Haqqani network and the ISK in some of the violence that has taken place. The division of labor and the nature of violence, particularly against Shias, between the Taliban and ISK is almost too neat not to think of a kind of controlling hand behind. There have been documented links between the LET and the ISK, and of course, everyone knows that all these threads also go back to the ISI. So there is this larger issue of a kind of Taliban-ISK kind of conflict. There are 20 to 30, militant, radical, extremist, some terrorist outfits operating in the entire Central Asian, even Iran, Jundullah, Pakistan, X number of, anti-sectarian as well as anti-Indian, as well as, agendas with other outfits with larger agendas, including the TTP in operation in and around Afghanistan. And now effectively, Afghanistan will be a base for all this. Actually, Pakistan may be tempted to push whatever extremist outfits there are in Pakistan, in fact, even to Afghanistan, and then say, we are a land of the pure. And so the story could continue from there.
But I want to ask you, because one gets a sense that the Taliban this time is well aware of, at least it's aware of, whether it's going to correct it or not, we don't know, but it's aware that it has a terrible record, and that if it wants world recognition, it has to do A, B, C, D, at least to some extent. And it has been, for the past year at least, been talking to the Americans, talking to the Chinese, talking to the Russians, and across the world, even the French, others, more recently. So is Pakistan going to be as important for the Taliban as it was before, given the fact that that Pakistan is not that important and is more exposed in the world order? So is it going to be able to exercise the same level of authority and control?
So this is a good question, which I think only time will tell. But I think there are 2-3 points that are worth bearing in mind. One is, there is no question that the Taliban have been raised by Pakistan. They have been their creature. And I talked about Taliban 2.0 and Taliban 3.0. The difference is that Taliban 1.0 was a religious militia. It was a militant outfit. It had an ultra-conservative agenda. It imposed that by repressive measures, but it didn't come to power through terrorism, and it wasn't actually a terrorist force as yet. Taliban 2.0 is the period when they were ousted from Afghanistan and pushed into Pakistan, when they actually turned to radical terrorism that included suicide bombing, complex attacks, IEDs, etc. And I've written an article for News 18 on this, on what I call Pakistan's 20-year hybrid war. So I'm not going to repeat that. But one thing very important, so they've been always under very close Pakistani control. Even now, for example, they released Mullah Baradar. Mullah Baradar was in Pakistani jails for 8 years.
Yes.
Mullah Umar was dead for 2 years. Mullah Haibatullah has not been virtually seen. And there's never been a whimper or a squeak from the Taliban publicly. Privately, we know that they chafe against Pakistani controls, but publicly, they have not been able to exert their autonomy or independence at all, even though particularly in the leadership, particularly the Quetta Shura, the Kandahar group, clearly have a sense of Afghaniyat as well. They are not 100% Pakistani, copies or something like that. So I think, yes, there are elements that would chafe and perhaps try to free themselves of Taliban control, but I would really take that seriously when we see something happening, because we know the sentiments are there, but we also know that Pakistani controls have been extremely strong. Again, Pakistan calculates, it factors in the fact that once they come to Kabul, as it happened with the Mujahideen, many of them tend to get defiant or even opposed to the Pakistanis. So it always has several horses in play, so that either they can be neutralized or they can be taken over by someone else. And actually what we are seeing with the Haqqani network is some such kind of operation. Because effectively what we have seen is a kind of partial Haqqani network takeover of the Taliban in the conflict that we are seeing between the Quetta Shura and the Loya Kandaharis against the Loya Pattia group of people. Secondly, on this question of international legitimacy, I think this is massively overplayed. If they really sought international legitimacy, why would they appoint 17 designated terrorists, including many who have returned from Guantanamo, in their cabinet? In fact, it seems to me actually an act of defiance. And I don't think legitimacy is that important, so long they have one or two powerful countries. If they have Pakistan and China with them, I don't think it's that important. What they seem to want, the only area in which, two areas which I see a difference, is that, yeah, at the top level, there's a little more sophistication, but a lot of that sophistication is also coming from, kind of Pakistani handling. But one thing that is different from the last time is that this time they seem to be much more acutely aware that they need international aid or investment. In other words, they need money to keep the country running. And this fits in also with Pakistan's larger idea of geoeconomics, try to try to impose stability or control, not only through ideology, but also through some kind of economic investment and development. And that's where China comes in. So, provided they feel that they can get this from, let's say, China, I don't think they are particularly concerned about.
So, you're looking at really something like a declining US, and not for reasons not just to do with Afghanistan, but its entire West Asian policy and that regional policy. Right. And then you have this ascendant China, which is using economics, as you said, to move into the region. And now now Pakistan, to retain its control over Afghanistan, is moved away, obviously, from Washington to Beijing, and is working more closely with them on this whole experiment at the moment. Yeah. So so do you see that the Chinese hold on the region and here is going to be far more than anticipated, maybe even, and the Americans are really on their way out?
Yeah. So I think this question of the United States is a very big question. I like to say that it took 2 years after the Soviet withdrawal for the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc to disintegrate and collapse. 3 years for Najibullah to go. Another 4 years of intra-Mujahideen fighting before the Taliban came in. 5 to 6 years of the Taliban, and now 20 years after that, the Taliban are back. So, I would say that, yeah, there are very serious consequences for the United States and also for the world with this withdrawal. Perhaps not leading to a collapse of the United States, surely not. But, serious questions about the United States, particularly its support for democracy. Because the United States, Biden administration came to power under the sign of democracy, under the, faced with the threat of the insurgency in Capitol Hill, and vowed to protect democracy at home and abroad. But, you have Myanmar on the one side, where we don't see any great support for a really passionate democratic movement. And in Afghanistan, where democracy has been absolutely betrayed by the Americans for a violent theocracy, So definitely, there are very serious questions about what this means for the United States. Some people say the United States recovered from Saigon and Vietnam, so why can't it recover from this? So let's hold our jury on that. But yeah, I think the fact of the matter is that, as far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan still wants to play the double game. For various reasons, it still wants to keep the United States on its side, whether it's about the FATF and sanctions, or maybe there are some other reasons that we don't know. So Pakistan will continue to play games with the United States.
Yeah.
But I think patience, I think that kind of tolerance for Pakistani duplicity has surely declined.
Yes. And we have to also, like you said, see whether Pakistan holds its own in the manner that it did earlier. Or whether it's weaker today, we'll have to know. But, the Americans particularly, they have now, there's some scholars who have written that they had no choice but to withdraw because they knew that the Taliban was on the ascendant. They knew that their rule was over. They knew that there was great sense of fatigue amongst their soldiers, and that there was an intolerance for continuing war back home amongst their people. So American interests in that sense were running counter to their presence in Afghanistan, and which is why they had no other choice but to pull out. And actually even Trump said that we are pulling out, and Biden just hastened it. But both the parties, totally opposed to each other, both were together on this particular issue. And now Biden has said no wars, in this region. Now, how does this whole thing pan out?
Okay, I think that Afghanistan has been a headache, has been on the US and Western mind for more than 10 years, actually going back to the London conference and Obama's own period of presidency. And so in one form or the other, whether we talk of Obama's surge and withdrawal or later on President Trump, the wish to exit has been there. But the cost of the war in terms of blood and treasure to the Americans in the last few years has not been unbearable or excessively high. So the reason for their departure is not because of the cost of the war. Yes, the length of the war may have a sense. I think the sense of hopelessness that they were not going anywhere definitely had a bearing on it. But I would actually point to two more. First, a long-term reason and a short-term reason. I think the long-term reason is that the reason why the Americans find themselves in this position is that they entered Afghanistan with very limited objectives and actually tried to, and those objectives were Al-Qaeda and counterterrorism, international terrorism, not regional, what happens in the region. So it came in with very limited objectives. It came in with it spent a lot of money, which added to the corruption, which they are now reacting against, but it didn't really invest anything in Afghanistan. Most of all, it didn't invest in enabling Afghanistan to stand on its own feet. It did not even invest at a time when it had all kinds of international support post 9/11. It did not even invest in creating a kind of regional coalition against terrorism in the area. So for many reasons, the sense of hopelessness that they have arrived at now is partly because that they invested very little, and they did it. There are many mistakes, we could go into it, but they did the wrong things, and they spent the wrong kinds of money on the wrong kinds of things. They didn't invest anything, for example, in the economy. They didn't even invest in democracy. They didn't even, frankly, invest in the Afghan National Army. They just trained some counterterrorism units and some, counterinsurgency units. So there's one kind of set of problems that led to them. But I think in the last stage, I think the United States also determined that they were not just going to leave the region. They have been providing net security effectively to their greatest strategic rivals, China, Russia, and Iran in the region. And in some ways, it's baffling. It's counterintuitive to think that they should vacate and see the region to China at its weakest underbelly. But I actually think that the United States did not just cede space, out of fatigue or withdrawal, but that it actually wanted the Taliban back in order to destabilize the region and keep its strategic rivals in check. And at the same time, really shift its attention to particularly military attention. So what's happened now is that Afghanistan is now entrusted to the intelligence, whereas the military sort of focus has shifted to the Indo-Pacific. And in general, you have a trade and technology and other sort of global effort to also contain China. So I think that's the larger picture in which I could see, the US change in policy.
So and then you have the Americans who were all over the place, started Afghanistan, there was Iraq, there's Syria, there's Libya, threat over Iran, a very interventionist, nasty, almost brutal policy for countries that really hadn't come that much in their way and were definitely not supporters of terrorism. Would you say that because you were in Syria and that this was not really the case?
So, I think if we are talking about so-called the Arab Spring and what followed the destabilization of Syria, this was very much a kind of hangover of a previous neocon era, when they were out to, reconfigure, reset everything in West Asia to the advantage of Israel. I think to a large measure, with changes in Saudi, UAE, and other policies, I think the Americans now feel comfortable that this is a job more or less done, and that they can turn their focus elsewhere. And I think that's also one of the driving forces behind China's interest in Afghanistan. Because to the extent that China sees the United States vacating space, it allows China an opportunity and actually a temptation, it's a kind of mixed opportunity, a temptation to fill up the vacuum that is left behind by the United States in Afghanistan and connect with its $400 billion, 25-year geo-economic deal with strategic overtones with Iran. And of course, that would make China a major player in the Gulf and West Asia, which has not been so far. So, I don't know if the United States has factored this in, but there's a push and pull factor, I see. The pull factor is an attraction to be a player in that West Asia region as well. The push factor is that I think as China sees pressure building up in the Indo-Pacific, it's also seeking a continental route to its energy sources in the Gulf and Arab world.
And so where is India in all this? Where are we in Afghanistan? Where are we in West Asia? I know we have with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I think the entire alignment of forces has overturned. Whereas we had a democratic Afghanistan supported by the United States, West Europe coalition forces, democratic Asia, including India. Now you have exactly the opposite kind of equation with, Taliban, Afghanistan supported by Pakistan, perhaps supported by China, and with Russia and Iran also aligned against the United States and obviously more towards them. So I think, temporarily, this is clearly a big setback for us because, in effect, we don't have any allies in power in Afghanistan, and the overall configuration is unfavorable. But, I wouldn't put any particular date as the end of history or the end of Afghanistan's history. This is only a fresh chapter. I think that we should continue to remain invested in the 20-year generation that we invested in, which has made, I think, very fundamental transformations in Afghanistan. And there is today a much greater sentiment for freedom and for democracy in Afghanistan than perhaps there ever was. And so I think they remain our natural allies. I don't think it's possible to. And as far as Iran and Russia are concerned, I don't think we should take them as give up on them, because soon as Taliban shows its true colors, and as Pakistan unveils its post-Afghanistan agenda, because it can't just stop at that, Iran and Afghanistan will realize that Taliban are not their natural partners. Taliban will not be able to give Russia the security that it wants from the ISK. It will be fighting it himself. Iran will not have common interests over Farsiban, Afghanistan, over the Shias, the Hazaras, and so on. And these contradictions will come forth. Even China. I think fundamentally China wants stability. And Pakistan has invested in instability. China will be posed a very difficult choice between trying to stabilize Afghanistan, perhaps expecting the Taliban to stabilize Afghanistan, not just the ATIM, because it can solve its problems with the ATIM, let's say, or Taliban may be able to control ATIM, which is very difficult in my opinion, because all these groups are inextricably interlinked now. But what will it do with those 20, 30 other groups? And there a fundamental contradiction will come out with Pakistan as well. So I don't see China stepping in whole hog. It will probably test the waters. At some point, it might burn its fingers. It might recall, but it will remain invested. It will remain positioned to be able to take advantage of its positioning and the US absence in future, knowing full well that US is also going to be playing its own games in Central Asia.
Right. So I just want to sort of now bring this together and closer to home, which is Myanmar. So you were there. A lot has happened since, of course, your posting. I just want to go to the immediate thing now. One is, of course, the military rule. Two, the protests. Now, this is a protest without the big Democrat, who obviously is not, has burnt her bridges with the people. And there doesn't seem to be a very firm leadership. There is a crackdown. India's relationship and the world's relationship with Myanmar seems to be as strong as ever. There's nobody holding them accountable in the manner that people had expected when they were on the streets. So how do you see that now?
No, I would qualify that a little. I don't see India as firmly behind the military government for what it is doing in the way, let's say, Russia is behind. Even China, has been sending out signals to the NUG as well, and has sent some interesting conflicting signals on that. And I think India has actually just basically been watching and waiting and looking to see which side prevails so that it's not on the wrong side. But one major development has been is that, it's now, what, 8 months since the coup. And last month, exactly a month ago, the NUG declared an armed struggle as part of its, agenda, and it's part of its instrumentalities in Afghanistan. And that is beginning to hurt the Tamado. These local defense militias or forces, the People's Defense Forces, and there are signs that the NUG maybe is working on trying to kind of coordinate these various local defense. And a lot of these local and People's Defense Forces are in areas that have not been particularly, restive in the past. Places like Demoso, in Kaya, parts of Karen State, but particularly parts of Chin State, Bagwe region, Sagain region, which are towards the west of Myanmar and closer to the Indian border. So I don't see the Tamado winning friends. And in fact, it is beginning to lose friends. ASEAN is losing patience. Malaysia has, signaled that it is losing patience. And I think, this is going to grow. Look, originally, Min Aung Hlaing, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, had given themselves 1 year to be able to cobble together the USDP to be able to contest elections and restore what he called democratic rule. 8 months down the line, they are nowhere near. Things are looking much worse. Right. So I'm sure the government of India is watching this very closely. I think it hasn't made big mistakes as yet, but it has made small mistakes. I think it would be certainly much more accepting of refugees. I won't even call them refugees, because these are actually, technically speaking, asylum seekers, people seeking shelter from repression or violence. They've been following scorched earth policies in places like Klantalan, in Chin State, and earlier in Mindat. So I certainly think India should be more protective and welcoming of such people. But it hasn't made any, and the international community hasn't really moved. ASEAN has been stuck. Everyone has left the Myanmar problem to the ASEAN. We too have done that. For some time, I've been suggesting that, that neighboring countries, actually ASEAN should expand its initiative to include neighboring countries, so that a more reasonable, neighborly and Asian solution can be found.
Right. Okay, thank you so much. That was really interesting. Thanks a lot. So we are now in a fluid world, at least in the region, with all balls up in the air. And we don't really know and can't seriously predict where these will land. The Taliban is in power. It has reached out to governments, but there are too many contradictions, too many pulls and pressures, too many different voices within, which make experts like the ambassador we have just interviewed question its ability to provide a stable and reasonably democratic government. So we have to see which way it will go. But one thing, of course, is certain, that whichever way the government goes in Kabul, it will have an impact on the region. We will feel the ripples in New Delhi, as will other countries across this part of the world. The Americans at the moment are on a bit of a decline, which is not a permanent decline. They have moved out of this region. They have left it to the Taliban to control, in one sense. And on the other is China, which is on the ascendant and which is looking at this as a big opportunity to enter the region and consolidate its hold. Whether it will be able to, or not, is again something that has to be seen. So we're in for interesting days and weeks and months ahead. Let's keep a watch. Thank you.